I'm Stephen Erlanger. I work for the New York Times. I'm the diplomatic correspondent for Europe, based in Brussels. But I've also spent time with each of these people in their home places. I was Southeast Asia Bureau Chief, so I know Singapore very well. I've been in China a number of times. Jeff Sachs and I met in Moscow in the early days of Boris Yeltsin. I spent 1981, almost all of it, in Poland covering Solidarność, and I've been to Poland many times since. So we have a really good panel here. It's about a decade of democracy in China and Russia, which you could almost call the anti-decade or the anti-democracy decade. But these are two countries that matter to all of us. And I think we'll begin with China, because in some ways China is less in the news, but probably is more important. We'll see. So I have, as we go down, Sun-Yun Wu. Su is a researcher at the University of Zurich and specializes in China. Jeff Sachs, who a lot of you met last night, who is at Columbia as the Director of Sustainable Development, and everyone should know, is an economist. It's a very important part of who Jeff Sachs is. And then we have Jaroslav Kwisz, if I'm not mispronouncing it, or close enough, who is the editor-in-chief of the Polish journal Kultura Liberalna, based most of the time in Warsaw. So, Sue, tell us about China's democratic decade.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very happy to be here. So I would like to start off by saying that the Chinese government published a white paper on democracy in December of last year with a very interesting and intentional title, China, a Democracy That Works, outlining a very comprehensive version and vision of Chinese democracy. Now, you can imagine the reaction in this room is that there will be a lot of strong reactions about this, mostly negative from the West. And I can understand why many Western democratic countries will find it very difficult to accept the Chinese definition and model of democracy, because it looks really different from what they are used to. And also there is a very strange and somewhat disconcerting coexistence of supposedly democratic elements and a persistently authoritarian one-party rule. So as a researcher who has the opportunity to do fieldwork in China, to study political and democratic experiments, I've come to develop a much more nuanced perspectives about democratic development in China. So although I do recognize that the broader Chinese political system is not considered democratic according to Western standards, there are nevertheless what I call pockets of democratic possibilities, albeit constrained at the local level and in very selected areas. For example, democratic experiments have been undertaken to allow greater citizen participation, to enhance governance by enabling local officials to be more responsive and accountable to the people. Also, a fairly recent survey conducted by Harvard Ash Center has found that a lot of Chinese people are very satisfied with their government and the political system, although with the current strict COVID-0 policy, this might change. So I guess the big question that is also somewhat provocative is, how do we make sense of China's claim that it has a democracy that works? And what are the broader implications? I'm very excited and I look forward to discussing this with my fellow panelists as well as with the members of the audience.
Great.
Thank you.
Let me just follow up and ask you, I mean, we're coming up to a big party congress. You know, everyone's focused on this.
Absolutely.
Xi Jinping wants to be emperor for life. So how democratic is all that?
Well, I think as a researcher who does qualitative work, there is the high-level systemic political assessment of China, which we can all acknowledge that does not quite fulfill the democratic standards of the West. But I think if you really disaggregate the meaning of democracy, and I think this is something that scholars in academia try to do, you can see some vibrancy of citizen participation and democratic innovations happening at the very, very local level.
I mean, do you think this comes from the party's desire to make sure it's in touch with people who are upset or angry, people who, in other words, is this form of democracy another form of party exercise and control, or is it something more vibrant than that?
Absolutely. I think we have to be realistic about the presence of these democratic innovations and practices. I think the party is very concerned about keeping control. I think that's something that we will not be able to deny. But at the same time, they're very concerned about good governance and even democratic governance, because it is also to their benefit to ensure that the people's grievances are preempted, which is why participatory institutions and participatory practices are allowed. But they are managed definitely by the party. So you get a bit of that push and pull dynamic going on. At some points of time, in certain areas of China, you can have very vibrant developments. But at any point of time, the party can always sort of pull this back.
It's fascinating. Thank you, Sue. Yaroslav, talk about Russia's decade of, let's call it, democracy.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Well, I think there are some links between our subjects, and I would like to start with reminding you about a performance, a very moving one, that happened in Taiwan. There was an artist that asked a group of people to lay on the pavement and to remind people of the victims in Ukraine. It happened in Taipei. There was a kind of visual effect of showing people lying in the streets and pretending to be, well, dead bodies, in fact. But this was, first of all, at first glance, we would say that it was about solidarity. But in our discussions, we could also say that it was about something more. And it tells us a lot about Russia and China, but also about the perception of Russia and China. In fact, this link between Taiwan and Ukraine was a link that was made between the countries of what I call nervous sovereignty. The countries that are around empires, and those countries that would like to expand their territories in this way or another. And these countries, in fact, have a very special way of leading their foreign affairs and domestic politics. The fact that they are living their nervous sovereignty is something that is virtually omnipresent. And it's now we could see it since February, not only in Taiwan and Ukraine, but also Finland, Estonia, and obviously Poland. So what it means for us, first of all, to have this framing of nervous sovereignty means that we see different things than other Western countries. Then we take different political actions than the Western countries. And what is of perhaps utmost importance for the future, we expect a different outcome. Expected outcome is different. So to tell it, to go through these 3 points briefly. What is the framing? What do we see? We see not an event, the war, but a process. What is happening now is not an event, it's not a war, it's a chain in a link of events. And here we could discuss how far we go back in time, but it could be 3 years, or 2014, or 1989, or further on.
Number two?
So, number two, the actions that are taken. If you see it not as an event, but as a process, you think that you should, you are a part of the story that is experienced in Ukraine. So, actions are taken. There was 1 week that is perhaps the most telling in March, when leaders of Poland and other countries went to Kiev in person, because that they believed that this is when it was a risky moment. So they thought that it would be how you display your solidarity. And that was the very same moment when Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, they were calling Vladimir Putin. That's the very same week. So you could see, like in a shortcut, that different actions are taken. The outcome, the third point. If you see it as a process, not as an event, here is a huge elephant in the room as to the expected outcome. In fact, those countries of nervous sovereignty do not expect any kind of temporary truce. They expect to win the war because it's a part of the process. They would like to see empires, in this respect Russia, perhaps in 1991, to go back to the moment when the state was in such a state that their sovereignty. If you see it from the Russian viewpoint, it would be collapse. If you see it from the Estonian viewpoint, that would be a moment of getting out of the trap of history, to get back to the self-determination of people.
Sure.
And in the end, or maybe in the beginning, to the agenda of human rights. It's about your decision how to perceive the happiness, and getting out of the logic of spheres of influence. So this is a different framing when you see it not as an event but as a process, and I believe it's a very big elephant in our room.
That's good.
Thank you.
I mean, we will come to that, but first I just want to ask you more directly about opinion in Russia itself, because the Russians spend a lot of time, as in China, trying to figure out what annoys people, what's going on. I mean, it's not quite like in China where you have someone in every apartment building, but the Russians are paying quite a lot of attention. They do sophisticated polling, just to see where things are vulnerable. Do you see this accelerating? Do you feel it changing? Do you feel like somehow there is in Russia, it's very hard for us to tell. As journalists, we have to be these days under the new rules extremely careful. But do you see any real sign of, let's call it a democratic, popular uprising that will have any effect?
Well, we should perhaps be very cautious about our wishful thinking.
Yes,
we would
exactly.
we would really
That's
like
the problem of people in the neighborhood. There's a lot of wishful thinking.
We would like to see another protest in Tiananmen. We would like to see another wave of democratization in Russia. But what we see now is perhaps that we moved. Yesterday we talked a lot about disinformation, fake news, and disinformation age. Rightly so. But at the very same time, in many ways, we moved from 24 hours channel, mass media, to history manuals. And we have different ones, so different that in fact we are reading the same event in so different ways.
Yes.
So when you see Vladimir Putin's justification of his assault on Ukraine, it's very deeply rooted in history, in his reading of history.
Sure.
When you are seeing the counter-reaction of Ukrainians and, in fact, all those nations of nervous sovereignty, from Finland to Taiwan, the reading is
right. Okay,
very
good.
different.
Thank you. Jeff, it's very hard. You've got to be somehow the synthesis. But you've worked in both places. You have an understanding, I think, of how the systems work. What is your sense of, I mean, let's try to stick to the topic a bit, at least at the beginning, of democratic signs, movements in both countries. What's your take?
Yeah, my experience is that different societies have very deep-rooted political cultures and traditions that extend far back in history. and for good and for bad, and that these cultures are real, they are persistent, they are different, they don't rank on an easy scale that this is the best and this is the worst like we want to do. And we need an approach. I very much like what you said and agree with it. There are different narratives that are held, and these different narratives have merit. And the solution in a world of different narratives is to speak with each other more than we do. We in the United States, and I say we, what I really mean is our political elites, do not speak with Chinese political elites except to point fingers or to yell at them or to do other things. We certainly don't even shake hands with Russian leaders or diplomats. But I've lived my whole career for 42 years of active duty listening to different narratives and seeing those perspectives from different sides and finding a lot of merit in the various positions and saying if you would sit down to speak with each other, we'd actually get somewhere. So let me be specific.
Okay.
China looks today not completely different from the Han Dynasty, a centralized administrative state. And with Confucian culture, with a tradition of excellence of the Mandarins. When I speak with Chinese senior officials, which I do often, they are the best informed professionals I know in the world. When I deal with them, they know their brief. They're sophisticated, well-trained, occasionally my students. And they believe in professional excellence of a decentralized administrative state. And that political culture is more than 2,000 years old. When you are looking at Russia, it looks a lot like, Putin looks a lot like a Tsar. It's not an accident. That is a culture of authority and a culture of tradition. When I look at my own country, the United States, it is a semi-democratic, white-dominated, hierarchical, racist society that aims to preserve privilege by the elites. That's how it was formed in 1787. It was a slave-owning, genocidal country, killing Native Americans for a white culture. But amazingly, it still looks that way, although we're much more diverse now than we were.
Let me ask you this, Jeff, because this is...
I want to point out that these are deep cultural distinctions.
Right.
But we shouldn't just simplify because we say democracy and you know, these are, yes, it's important. What's important is actually the details. As I mentioned last night, Plato, democracy, that was the last thing on his mind. That was the enemy. The plus was a philosopher king, of course,
right,
in the Republic. And for Aristotle, it was much more subtle and complex of a system of governance that mixed governance by the one, by the few, by the many, but on the good side of the ledger. And one more point I want to make about democracy, because we're in a democracy forum where we treat democracy as the good. The most violent country in the world in the 19th century, by far, was perhaps the most democratic or second most democratic, and that was Britain. You can be democratic at home and ruthlessly imperial abroad. The most violent country in the world since 1950 has been the United States. It's
Jeff,
been by far involved
Jeffrey,
in more,
stop now.
in more wars.
Jeffrey, I'm Jeffrey, I'm your moderator, and it's enough.
Okay, I'm done.
I'm not here to defend one system or another, nor am I here in any way except to facilitate a conversation and to stop speeches. So the question I'm going to ask you is democracy the wrong lens then, from what you've said, to be looking at these two countries, which is what's on the table, China and Russia?
Is it
the wrong lens
Yes.
through which to be looking at these two countries?
The single biggest mistake of President Biden is to say the great struggle of the world is between democracies and autocracies. The real struggle of the world is to live together and overcome our common crises of environment and inequality.
Good, thank you.
Thanks.
So, actually, the idea of this panel is probably wrong-headed, I think. Let me come back to the Russia-China relationship, because we've heard a lot about friendship without limits. A friendship without limits isn't necessarily an alliance. So has the movement of the war, has it altered to, do you think, the Chinese notion of Russia and what the future could bring to both countries? Or do you think it's underlined, which it may have done, the sense that they are trying to break a world order that they didn't build and which they don't like and that doesn't serve them?
So I don't think that, I think we have to clarify this. A lot of the mainstream media, I find, has conflated sort of China's lack of condemnation of Russia to be equivalent to the support of the war, which I think it's not a very constructive way to look at how China looks at the whole Ukrainian-Russian crisis. I think China has interest to sort of sit on the fence and to play a very, very delicate balancing act between sort of living up to the sort of this close relationship and also to prevent itself from being too isolated from the West if it's seen as supporting Russia unequivocally. So I think as the war has become so protracted, even Chinese public opinion has started to turn away from Russia, and I think this is a very interesting development recently. Yeah. And also Chinese state media has toned down its more supportive tone towards Russia, so I think you can really start to see how the effects of sort of Putin's mobilization has been.
I was talking to a scholar from Shanghai who was saying, as we all know, that Chinese leadership does see the United States in pretty terminal decline, but not yet, please.
But not yet.
But not yet, because we actually need the United States, we need trade, we don't want to have a war now, we're not ready, blah, 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 blah. And I thought that was, again, much as Jeff said, a fairly sophisticated view of real national interest, which is, you know, they don't want to be left alone, and they don't want a conflict that they really don't need to have right now. So, Yaroslav, what's your take on this friendship alliance? What's the status of it?
First, it makes me think about the fact that democracy travels, to follow up what you said. We are in Athens, but democracy traveled in space and time. It traveled from Athens to the first Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to England, to the United States, but it travels, but it's always imperfect. But it doesn't mean that but we should be restrained about the choice of democracy. I had the privilege of experience the reforms that you, Jeffrey, proposed in Poland, and I'm grateful for that in many ways, because in fact we are discovering the fact that over time, democracy is not perfect. It not only travels in space and time, but it's not perfect, it has many flaws. Nonetheless, now the democracy travels and it's in Ukraine. And every inch of Ukrainian territory that was taken by Russia is a territory when we understand what it means, that democracy is there or not, that the crave for democracy could be expressed or not. In fact, we are talking about narratives. In the region, the narrative is that we know all that. Last week I was at the conference in Estonia. It is the impression is that we know all that, not since 2014. We know that since 300 years. Puppet leaders, forged elections, kidnapped, political kidnapping, and all that is a part of the struggle that is between, in fact, perhaps not civilization, so as not to go to Huntington's area, which I dislike, but it is a kind of struggle between polities. It is a kind of struggle between political regimes that is virtually taking place. And you know, in Poland we have 3 million of Ukrainian refugees. Now, refugees, more to the point, women and children. And what it means to fight for democracy is now to listen to the stories of a woman that came back from Lviv last week, sure. And she comes and says, you know what I saw? I saw a child without 2 legs and 1 hand. I saw a person that has lost her eyes. I saw another person from Mariupol that is so thin because she doesn't know where her son is, and she is not aware of if he's dead or alive. So this is now the struggle of democracy and the human rights that we started in 1989 in the region.
Yeah. And even in 1956, by the way. So the one thing I know, having covered both, war and occupation are tragedies, but they're very good teachers, I have to say. They could be very instructive if you're listening for lessons. We've got about 7 minutes left. I want to go to you. I think there's a lot going on here, and I want you to keep it going. I'd like to first call on one of our students that we have here. You're very far away, so someone should stand up and raise their hand so I can see them. I see a young man with a hand way up in the air with a black shirt on. Yes, sir. Why don't you? But please try to ask a question and direct it to someone specific, if possible.
Okay, thank you very much for the discussion.
And introduce yourself.
Okay, too. I'm Tomáš Choj from Slovakia, representing Global Liberal Arts Students Alliance here. I would like to ask Mr. Sachs, continuing on what he said yesterday, and he sort of pointed out it today as well. What you mentioned is that the United States and the West lacks moderation, and you sort of hinted on that as well. I come from Slovakia, as I've said, and I would like to ask you, what do you mean by your sentence or by your hint that the eastward expansion might have caused, or the NATO might have caused the invasion, and whether Slovakia as a sovereign country shouldn't have the right to decide where it belongs mainly NATO. Thank you.
That's clear. Let's take one more question from back there. Yes, sir.
Hi. Good morning, everybody. I'm from Hong Kong, and I'm representing the Global Liberal Arts Alliance, and I'm going to ask a question about that. So, Mr. Sachs, you just raised that we should, the top political agenda is to alleviate inequality instead of arguing with each other which one is not democratic or democratic. But there are indeed authoritarian regimes which are they really motivated to tackle inequality while they build gulags in Xinjiang, jailing students and dissolving civil society in Hong Kong, and fading a history of large-scale killings in the Cultural Revolution? Well, I'm risking my only freedom of speech of saying that because I live in Hong Kong. But is that hypocritical or morally decent for the West to collaborate with them to alleviate inequalities as the first agenda to solve, while not condemning their
That's
the
good.
dangerous?
It's clear. Thank you. Thank you. That's clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Jeff, do you want to respond to those first?
Yeah. My view is that we need a world that operates under two major charters. One is the United Nations Charter, and the second is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is our moral charter. That's a multilateral charter. It is based on the idea of international cooperation that was envisioned after the horrors of World War II. It is, in my view, the basis for peace. In 1990, the basis for peace, when Gorbachev called for the end of the Warsaw Pact, was the end of NATO, actually, as well. And Europe living under a European security framework, and that's what the OSCE could provide. I've never been a fan of NATO since the end of the Soviet Union. NATO was a military alliance of the United States created to defend against a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And the United States and Germany promised Gorbachev in 1990 explicitly that with the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and with the reunification of Germany, NATO would not expand eastward. That promise was immediately reneged by Clinton and then by Bush, and then it has continued under Obama and under Trump, up to and including NATO in the Black Sea, which, if anyone knows the history of the Black Sea, is absolutely viewed by Russia as the core of Russian security. And so it is a pure provocation, in my view. And it is a predictable outcome that we have this kind of explosion. So to my mind, prudence, that was the idea that I was emphasizing yesterday. Prudence, which is one of the four virtues, practical wisdom, it's often translated, or phronesis in Greek, means situational awareness, that you act in a way which is wise. And that's what we are lacking right now. And I know exactly why we're lacking it, because in 1992, the leaders in my country, many of my colleagues at Harvard and elsewhere, said, we are now the unchallenged colossus of the world. We can do what we want.
Jeffrey,
and just to say, wait, just let me, because he asked, I'm going to finish the answer, and then I will give the floor to you. Sorry. So, okay, just to say, if you say who made most of the wars of recent years, first, NATO bombed Serbia in 1999. UN, no way. The invasion of Iraq under complete lies, not misunderstanding, but lies. The CIA operation to overthrow Assad in 2009.
I think you've answered
the NATO mission to overthrow Gaddafi. And then we say, how can anyone launch a war? Well, 4 of the last 5 came from the United States side. And NATO enlargement did as well. We need some balance and prudence. That's my point.
You've answered the question last night at great length, and you've answered it again at great length. So,
honestly,
Yaroslav, respond, and then we're out of time.
Sure. I'm a bit surprised because, as I have already said, in 1989 and afterwards, you, Jeffrey, promoted the liberty and democracy and values, not. And what it means, it means that today, if we try to blame the West for the war, it is to take away responsibility, a whole or a part, whatever, from Vladimir Putin. It was he who took the decision of leading a war in February. And it's very ambiguous to take this responsibility out of him. That was his personal decision that he justified in many ways. And the second point, it is fascinating to me to see that your person, in particular, you were a promise for me for the liberty that eventually we could get out of these horrible spheres of influence and stand for the human rights and self-determination of nations, and in fact to get out of the trap of history. What it means not only for Poland, but for Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia, to get out of the history trap and
I understand. Jaroslav,
get out of 300 years of
listen.
Wait. For the God's sake, where are the human rights?
I've completely failed you as your moderator, for which I apologize. We have a really good conversation going. We will continue it later because
1 minute?
Because the whole
we're on the same side.
Okay.
Explains one thing.
So 30 seconds,
30 seconds.
And then we have to keep going. And I do apologize. I love this conversation, but it's the wrong place to have it all day long.
I love your country, and I worked as hard as I possibly could for it. And I want you to know that when the Solidarity government took power with...
You were with us.
Not only I was helping to devise that with Prime Minister Mazowiecki, who made it possible? Mikhail Gorbachev. Actually, with the call with Adam Michnik, a very fascinating moment in history. So it's more complicated than this. We need both sides working together, and it's possible.
Great. I think we've explained a bit of what our complications are. We will keep talking because democracy is about debate. He says in a great cliche, but it's true. But let me now thank my panel and introduce Liz Alderman, who will do the next affair about photographs with Alexander Chekmenov, who's a Ukrainian photographer. So thank the panel and thank you all.